All right, so we've got a pretty hefty stack of notes here today, and it looks like it's all about international organizations, mainly the UN. And oh, yeah, I see you've even got a few of those classic satirical cartoons about how well the UN actually works or
Well,
doesn't work.
yeah, it seems like someone's trying to figure out if the UN is just a bunch of outdated ideas or if it's actually got a shot at dealing with all the crazy stuff happening in the world today.
You hit the nail on the head. It's 2024, and we've got rogue states popping up left and right, emerging superpowers vying for influence, climate change throwing everything out of whack. It makes you wonder, does an organization that was basically born out of the ashes of World War II even stand a chance? So let's dive into this whole thing. First things first. Why do we even need these big international organizations in the first place?
Well, imagine a world where countries just didn't talk to each other. No agreements, no platform for dialogue, just every nation out for themselves. That's kind of the nightmare scenario that the folks who created the UN back in 1945 were trying to avoid. I mean, after two horrific world wars, they were desperate for some kind of system that would prevent another global conflict.
Right, the whole never again idea. But when you look at the world today, conflict is still everywhere. Has the UN really lived up to those big idealistic goals of world peace?
See, the thing is, the UN was never supposed to be some kind of global police force. It's all about countries working together. It's more like a global town hall, a place where countries can hash out their differences before things escalate into something way worse.
So it's about diplomacy then, trying to stop those small disagreements from turning into major conflicts.
Exactly. But it's not just about putting out fires. It's about figuring out what's causing them in the first place. And that's where things get really interesting. Take the UN Development Program, for example.
Yeah.
They call it UNDP for short. They're tackling things like poverty, inequality, lack of development, all of those issues that can easily lead to conflict.
So they're trying to create a more stable and fair world.
Yeah.
The idea being that a fairer world is ultimately a more peaceful world. But how do they actually make that happen? With so many different countries and competing interests, it seems like an impossible task.
Well, it's definitely not easy. One example is the work they're doing in the Sahel region of Africa. It's an area facing extreme poverty, climate change, and, of course, conflict. The UNDP is working directly with communities there to improve access to clean water and renewable energy sources, create job opportunities, and build resilience against the impacts of climate change. The goal is to break the cycle of poverty and instability, which, as you can imagine, is a long and complex process.
It sounds like it. So the UN isn't just about high-level diplomacy. They're also working on the ground in some of the toughest places imaginable, trying to address the root causes of conflict. Okay, so we've got the UN working on peace and development, tackling those big picture issues. But my notes here mention a whole bunch of different UN agencies. What's the deal with that? It's not all about preventing World War III, is it?
You're right. The UN is kind of like this massive toolbox. Each agency has its own specialty, and they're all working on different parts of these global challenges.
So it's like a global Swiss Army knife, ready for anything.
Yeah, something like that. Let's take the World Health Organization, for example. Everyone calls it WHO. They're the ones in the front lines of global health issues. They coordinate responses to pandemics, like remember the COVID-19 outbreak, but they also work on things like eradicating diseases, improving maternal health, and making sure people have access to essential medicines.
Right, because health issues don't really care about borders. And speaking of crossing borders, what about refugees? There are millions of people who have been displaced by conflict and persecution.
That's where UNHCR comes in, the UN Refugee Agency. They provide emergency relief, shelter, and protection for refugees and displaced people. It's a huge job, especially with the number of people being displaced these days. But they also work on longer-term solutions like resettlement and helping refugees rebuild their lives.
It's hard to imagine having to flee your home like that. And what about the children who get caught in the middle of all of this?
Protecting children is a top priority for UNICEF. That's the UN Children's Fund. They work all over the world to provide healthcare, nutrition, education, and protection for children in need. They've made amazing progress in reducing child mortality rates and getting more kids into school.
Wow, so the UN is doing a lot, from working in conflict zones to classrooms and hospitals. It's like they're trying to build a better future piece by piece.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then there's UNESCO. They focus on education, science, and culture. They do things like protect cultural heritage sites, promote scientific collaboration, and ensure freedom of expression.
Hold on, so the UN is in the business of protecting ancient ruins and promoting science. That's quite the range.
It might seem that way, but it's all connected. Take climate change, for instance. UNESCO is working to protect coral reefs, which are not only beautiful and culturally important, but also play a crucial role in the health of our oceans. They're also using their platform to promote scientific literacy and educate people about climate change.
Okay, that makes sense. It's all about recognizing that these global problems are interconnected.
Exactly. And speaking of challenges, we can't talk about the UN without mentioning the calls for reform. The world has changed a lot since 1945. And a lot of people think the UN needs to adapt to stay relevant.
Right. I was just looking at this cartoon in my notes. It shows the UN as this big, clunky machine trying to navigate this fast-paced, interconnected world.
It's a common criticism for sure. People question whether an organization that was designed right after World War II is really equipped to deal with the complexities of the 21st century.
So we're talking about a world that's changing crazy fast, and the UN, this organization with its roots in the past, I mean, is it even possible to update something like that? Or is it more like trying to teach an old dog new tricks?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The calls for reform are definitely getting louder. And there are basically two main schools of thought on this.
Two schools of thought.
Yeah. So the first group is all about structure and process. They say the UN's organizational chart needs a major makeover to reflect how the world works today.
So it's less about what the UN does and more about how they do it.
Exactly. They're asking the tough questions like who actually gets a say? How are decisions made? Does the balance of power need to shift?
Interesting. And what about that second group? What's their take?
They're all about expanding the UN's to-do list. They argue that the UN needs to be more proactive in tackling new global challenges.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, think about it. Climate change, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, even regulating outer space. These are all 21st century issues that weren't even a blip on the radar back in 1945.
It's true. It's like trying to fight a cyber war with a typewriter. But those are some pretty heavy issues to add to an already massive workload.
And that's actually one of the main criticisms. Critics say the UN is already stretched too thin, and giving them even more responsibility would just make them less effective overall.
Okay, so we've got calls for internal restructuring and potentially expanding their mission. So where does this whole Security Council reform debate fit into all of this?
That's a perfect example of those calls for structural change. The Security Council is supposed to be the one maintaining international peace and security. But its structure, with those 5 permanent members and their veto power, that's straight out of the post-World War II playbook.
Right, those veto powers. It's kind of like having a board meeting where 5 people always get their way no matter what.
Yeah, that's a common criticism. A lot of people say that the veto power is undemocratic and gives way too much influence to a select few.
But I imagine there's got to be another side to that argument. Why keep the veto power if it's so controversial?
Well, the people who support it say it's the only way to keep those powerful countries engaged. The thinking is that if those countries could be outvoted, they'd just walk away from the UN altogether. And that would obviously make the UN a lot less effective.
That's a tough one. I mean, on the one hand, it does seem unfair that a handful of countries can just overrule everyone else. But on the other hand, if taking away that power makes them leave, is that really helping global cooperation? It's like walking a tightrope.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
And this whole debate is playing out right now with India's push for a permanent Security Council seat.
Right. And they've got some strong arguments. Huge population, the world's largest democracy, a fast-growing economy. Plus, they've been very vocal about wanting a more representative Security Council. But not everyone's thrilled about the idea. What are the concerns about giving India a permanent seat?
Well, some countries are worried about upsetting the balance of power in the Security Council. There are also concerns about India's nuclear weapons program, and their sometimes tense relationship with Pakistan.
And then there's the whole domino effect thing. If India gets it, what about Brazil, Germany, South Africa? It could open up a whole new can of worms.
Absolutely. But this whole debate really highlights a fundamental question. How can the UN's power structures change to reflect a changing world?
It's a big question, for sure. And while we're trying to figure all of that out, we've still got the world's only superpower operating within this system. Can the UN really keep the US in check?
That's a tough one. The U.S. has a lot of sway within the UN, partly because of how much money they contribute, and partly because of their permanent seat on the Security Council.
But the UN isn't just a platform for the US to do whatever it wants, is it?
Definitely not. One of the most important things the UN does is give other countries a platform to voice their concerns, even if it's just forcing the most powerful countries to explain their actions on a global stage.
So it's not about whether the UN is perfect, because clearly it's not. It's about whether it's still a necessary platform for dialogue, cooperation, and hopefully making some progress on the world's biggest challenges.
Yeah,
But you've definitely given me a lot to think about. It seems like the UN is this kind of paradox, this organization that's dealing with huge global problems, trying to keep peace and create a better future. But at the same time, it's wrestling with its own internal issues and the weight of history.
It's a fascinating story, and it's still being written.
That's what I love about these deep dives. We started with a stack of notes and ended up with even more questions. And for everyone listening, the journey doesn't have to end here. This is just one piece of the puzzle. We've barely scratched the surface of international organizations. There are so many more fascinating stories out there. From the inner workings of the World Bank to the often controversial role of the International Monetary Fund.
Each one a deep dive waiting to happen.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and never stop exploring the complexities of our world.